guys, welcome to another BigLipz podcast. For those who don't know, my name is Kathryn, joined as always my good friend Sam Macaulay Blair. And basically we are two kind of independent film makers. I almost said students there, not anymore. And yeah, we basically meet every couple of weeks to discuss film and TV. Basically, season 1 of the BigLipz podcast was mainly focused on movies, and we moved on to season 2 where we're speaking specifically about TV. So yeah, this is episode 17, and we are a little bit late on this one because spooky season has kind of passed, but oh well, when in Rome. So yeah, this week we're going to be discussing all about kind of horror TV shows and what that entails, different tropes. Obviously, we've had a previous podcast where we've had a few podcasts actually where we've spoken about horror, and one specifically was about what makes horror scary. So we'll obviously be kind of drawing on things from there for this podcast, but as I said, it's going to be specifically about TV shows. So yeah, basically, Sam, we'll just jump right in. What are your thoughts on like horror TV shows? Do you like them? Do you not like them? Are you indifferent to them? Because I know obviously we've spoken about it before. We're both kind of big horror fans, so I'm interested to see what your thoughts on the actual horror like TV is.
Yeah, no, I mean, as we discussed a lot, and both on the podcast and outside of it, massive fan of horror like yourself. Like one of, if not my favourite genres. And I love as well, since you mentioned spooky season, quite thematically appropriate that we're not letting Halloween stay dead, basically. I've dug it up just for this. But I love that whole, the whole sort of vibe and atmosphere of like Halloween, and I love like the sort of chilly evenings and the brown leaves and the sort of like glimmering like pumpkins. As I think I said to you, like I've managed, just at least in the last week leading up to Halloween, I did manage to very much get into like the Halloween mentality, both watching horror shows and like going to see horror films in the cinema, and then even like playing horror video games and listening to horror soundtracks. So it's safe to say that I am a fan of horror.
Listening to horror soundtracks is hardcore. I'm not even going to deny that. That's
There's
hardcore.
some banging ones. There's some really, really good ones out there.
Do you listen to like the Jaws theme, like when you're sitting in your house, like walking to work, up you're like, oh, here's a tune.
I really, really like the the new not the newest one, but the 2018 Halloween film. The soundtrack to that is fantastic. Obviously, like takes a lot from the original. And yeah, there's just some good ones. Nightmare on Elm Street is a good one. The Thing has a great soundtrack. And yeah, like a lot of TV shows and stuff as well. There's been like scores that I've heard on that where I've been like, oh, that's a nice wee bit of a composition. I'll be listening to that one day. So yeah, all in, big fan of horror. When it comes to horror TV, I probably haven't actually seen as much of it as you might think, but I also think, I'm just trying to mentally structure what I say here so that I don't jump ahead of myself too much here. I don't think altogether that TV and horror have really figured out how to make this whole thing work.
Okay.
I think they're still in a bit of an awkward phase where like, there's definitely something there. There's there's definitely like an interest and a bit of chemistry, but I think they haven't really figured out the dynamic, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I mean, horror is obviously very difficult to do as well, because you need to draw out like a very specific emotion. You're sort of looking for something quite tangible. And the same way, we discussed obviously comedy before, and the purpose of comedy is obviously to make you laugh. The purpose of horror is to make you feel afraid. I mean, you can argue there's more to it than that. Same with comedy though, but that is like, if you ask someone what they thought of a horror, usually the way that they will respond is by discussing how scary they found it.
Yeah.
That tends to be like the biggest thing, the make or break. So I think there's kind of like a lot of untapped potential where horror TV is concerned. So as a result, I mean, again, I don't think there's as many horror shows. I think there's a lot of shows that dabble with like horror elements. That kind of seems to be the niche that horror's carved in TV for the most part. You'll get shows that aren't necessarily horror on like face value, but they have moments where they like will sort of I guess like swing into that genre. And again, we did a podcast ages ago on like genre bending, and I think I think it's maybe more prevalent in TV just because TV is a longer format and it generates more interest. So you will often see like, I mean, again, you get like Halloween special episodes, but you'll get like storylines or like parts of seasons and stuff, or episodes that will just be scarier of like certain shows than other ones. And I always think it's more interesting. I think I guess when it's like a concentrated part of something. I think we discussed Legion as well. Like, you know, that had like sort of horror elements. And I think it can be quite effective when a show. I guess when there's like an unpredictability to it, it can be quite effective. Because you don't really expect to find yourself on the edge of your seat in the same way. Whereas I think maybe going into like 10 hours of content, expecting to be scared the whole time is a bit difficult for a show to do. Because that's a lot of like, it's either a lot of jump scares or a lot of like tension that you're trying to build, and
that's
but
a
yeah.
lot of like just from a writing point of view, that's a lot of writing. Like even like, you know how when you obviously we've both written like shorts and things like that, and they're maybe like 20 minutes long max, and that's like 30 odd pages, like
Yeah.
and that's for 20 minutes. Can you imagine just the sheer volume of work that goes into just creating 10 hours worth of scary content?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's
unless I suppose you're Stephen King, who can fire out a horror book in about 10 minutes.
I know, and yeah, it's a very, very good point actually. I guess they have like adapted a few of his books into TV series, but not as many as you might think that they would have done by this point, considering like how many books he's written and how like long TV's been going.
He's just got like an endless stream of like material to work with. Like, if you don't like one, just fire your way through the other 100 books.
Exactly. Yeah, there's bound to be a Stephen King book out there for you, whoever you are. But yeah, I think like a lot of horror TV I've seen hasn't really scratched the itch that I would have liked it to, and yeah, I think like especially when you compare it to movies, I do think that like I think the format itself kind of brings to light some of the limitations of the genre, and yeah, I just don't think that it has the same success rate as movies do. I don't think it manages to sort of capture what movies have with horror. I think they have a very specific relationship, movies and horror, that does work, is functioning. Yeah. That's like your ideal framed picture of like this is what you should be aiming for.
Yeah.
And they're trying. What about you? I've talked more than enough now. What are your thoughts?
I think pretty similar to yours. One of the things I wrote specifically was that it's, again, very similar to you. It's so difficult, I feel, to get like I feel like obviously there's exceptions with franchises like Halloween and Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and that, where there's like a lot of movies within the franchise. But I think historically, the further into the movies you get, the worse they kind of get, and then obviously it becomes a bit ridiculous. Like the Friday the 13th movies, where I'm sure like they're like just out in space, and one of them it turns into like a bit of a joke. So I feel like that maybe highlights the fact that horror is quite difficult to do in a sequel form or like over an extended period of time. And like you were saying, TV shows or horror TV shows can be anywhere between like 4 up to like 10 hours long, potentially more depending on how many episodes there are. So I feel like that's definitely one of the drawbacks to it, is that they've got such a huge amount of time to keep it scary, which like you were saying is difficult. I do love the idea of horror TV, because like we were talking about, like you were saying, when you kind of embrace spooky season and you were listening to soundtracks and playing the games, I think it's such a nice other kind of like way to like ingest horror is via TV shows. But I would definitely agree that there's just something there. I feel like they're getting there, but yeah, there's something just not. Maybe it is just because I feel like horror TV's maybe it's definitely more like popular now. I don't remember, other than maybe what was that show, Goosebumps, or what was the other one, Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids.
Yeah, what throwback that is.
That was scary.
That was scary.
That was.
Haunted by that show.
Maybe that's why we enjoy horror so much. We're in
I know,
at
it
such
all
an
started
early
with
age.
Grizzly Tales.
But yeah, I feel like it's a lot more kind of popular now. I don't know whether that's, we've spoken about it endlessly, but like because TV's changed. We watch it on streaming sites, and I feel like streaming sites in particular are so into like having shows getting really popular and going viral and things like that. Pretty reasonably easy way to do that is to have something pretty scary, and then people are going to watch it to be like, did I think that was scary? I'm going on a bit of a rambling point here, but I feel like
I rambled a lot longer, so
I feel like that kind of hinders it as well slightly, because they're maybe not making it for the actual story. They're more making it just for jump scares or just for it to be particularly horrifying, which works sometimes. But I feel like a really good horror is maybe like, I'm trying to think, like for example The Thing, because obviously we both went to see that recently. It's such an effective horror because it's not what you're seeing is not just scary, like the thought of what's happening, and this idea of you're not knowing who's themselves and things like that. I feel like a good horror just gets right inside your head, and like it makes you feel like you are in danger as well. Whereas I feel like potentially there's the fear that with these kind of shows that are just almost like made to be viral hits are pretty like two-dimensional, they're pretty flat. Once you get over the initial maybe first 2 episodes, it gets quite boring, which I've heard a lot with people talk about different shows that have been really popular on Netflix. They're like, yeah, I watched the first 2 episodes and then I never went back.
I think what you're saying, I mean, this was stuff that I'd kind of put down for a later discussion, but I might as well bring it up now since a lot of what you're saying is like touching on it. Because I very much agree with what you're saying, and it's similar sort of things that I thought. And one thing that I wrote down was TV is slutty, and
yes.
it is in the sense that like, and we talked about this again with like literally the last podcast on like cliffhangers, and how it kind of does rely on word of mouth and like generating a certain level of hype and interest and getting people talking about it. That's kind of what TV's always been, isn't it? Like it's always had people like discussing and theorizing, and I think you mentioned The Thing. Like if you were to do conceptually, you could take that and expand it into a TV show. It'd probably make a really good TV show, but at the same time, you would lose a lot because it would become less about like you say, you're watching the movie. When you're in the movie, you don't even really get the movie hits you with the premise when you're already inside the film, and then the movie's always like kind of ahead of you, so it can really like play on like it can have like something happen. There's a scene where like the dog walks in and there's a character, you just see their shadow and they turn. It's before you even know like anything about like what the dog is. But I remember reading something where John Carpenter said that they deliberately, the shadow that they use was shot in such a way it was none of the cast, but it was a guy that they got who looked enough like his shadow looked enough like 2 of the characters so that you would never know which it was. And there's just like all these little things that it can do. It can like plant things and like make you sort of paranoid. I think if you then made that a TV show, it would become less of a horror and more of like a sort of whodunit. You'd have people, you would get a lot of speculation out of it, but it would become a case of like, well, who do we think is the thing and who's not the thing and why do we think this? And you would pick apart everything, but maybe in like the wrong sort of way, or maybe not in the wrong way, but it just would then, it takes away the fear. And I think as a result, it would, I think, it kind of struggles, it struggles, I think it's a conflicting thing, that whole like needing to generate interest, needing to like draw people in, and have people come back week after week, and at the same time be scary, because like I think really I can't think of like there are good horror shows, but I can't think of any horror show that's had me in any way close to as scared as I was watching something like Hereditary. Like actually sitting in like a cinema, or even I watched Hereditary in like in a flat, but watching like an actual horror film and genuinely being like sick with dread. You just don't get that from a show, and I think a big part of that is like probably like a reluctance on like the showrunner's part, because like I mean, how would you, as much as you watch horror to be scared, I don't really know if you would finish Hereditary and go, perfect, let's put on Hereditary 2 right now.
Yes, that's such a good point. Yeah, that's such a good point. Obviously, this kind of feeds into the next discussion point, which is kind of how do they differ from horror films. And I feel like that's so interesting because I feel like obviously you know at any point that you, unless you're in the cinema, that you could like just get up and turn the telly off and stop the movie, but
Yeah.
there's almost, I feel like for me anyway, there's that thing where you're like, I've started and it's only 2 hours long or whatever, so I might as well finish it. Um, Whereas like
Especially,
same with, oh sorry,
I think if you watch horror with someone as well, that sometimes there's like almost an element of like chicken, where you're just
yeah,
like, well, I'm not putting it off.
yeah, I'm not that scared. You're probably more scared than
Yeah.
I
Yeah, the other person, they can turn it off if they're
am.
that scared.
Yeah. Whereas like I was saying, I've heard a lot of people talk about different horror TV shows where they've said, "Oh, I watched 2 episodes and then I just didn't go back." Um, yeah, I feel like it's a lot harder to like keep people hooked in a kind of interesting way than it is. Really, with movies, again, that just could just be because you've almost got like your audience is almost like, I wouldn't say captive, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like yeah, you're definitely more likely to stop watching a TV show than you are halfway through a film.
Exactly, and I think even with like certain TV shows, like I remember years ago, again another show that we talked about recently. I remember when I watched Breaking Bad, and that is a show that obviously like terrific TV series, but it just gets like increasingly, it raises the stakes and kind of gets bleaker as it goes. But I just remember watching it and just at times being like, I just don't want to. I think I'd put on like there was like a comedy series I started watching at the same time because I was like, I kind of just don't want to feel like crap.
Yeah,
I want to just
yeah, it's
like
very bleak.
put something nice on for a bit. And I think that's the thing as well. Is like that's another part of it. Like you could really push the horror and really make these characters that like are going to suffer. But again, like when you're on hours 8 and 9, are you really putting on the next episode? Especially if you've like stopped watching it, are you really going to be like, yeah, all right, okay, let's watch another couple hours of like people going through the worst times of their lives? Like it would be draining.
That's such a good point because I feel like obviously like a lot of TV shows are like or like dramas or things tend their seasons can maybe be up to like 24 episodes. Can you imagine having to sit and watch 24 episodes of a horror show? Like,
I
there's
know.
no way you would be finishing that. So that's probably why they're only like 10 hours long. Because even then, when you think about it, 10 hours is a huge amount of time. Like, if you thought about that in one day, that's like mine out with work. Like, that's like almost your entire day.
I guess that kind of begs the question then of format. And I don't mean format as in like TV versus movie, but I mean format as in like, because this wasn't something I'd written down, but just triggered there when you were saying. But I guess when you look at like you'd struggle to do a 24 episode season of a horror show. That like melted my brain for some reason. Of a horror series, but you do get loads of like comedy series that are like 24 episodes, but they will be much shorter. You have like sitcoms that are like 20-30 minutes long. Comedy shows in general tend to be like 20-30 minutes long. You don't really tend to get like hour long comedy shows that I can think of. At least not, definitely wouldn't get one that I can think of that would run for like that many episodes.
Yeah.
And I guess it's because like, again, even though like they're funny and people like laughing, I think it might be a bit much if you just had like 24-hour long episodes. Whereas like the sort of 20-minute format again is very digestible and you can kind of like get in and out and you can kind of be funny and quite succinct. But horror does kind of necessitate a lot of like a slower pace and a lot more build up, and it does kind of rely on like you being stuck in one place for longer rather than like a shorter period of time. Kind of can't do that, can it? You couldn't really have like a 20-minute. I mean, you could have like a 20-minute horror series, but I think it would be a bit of a tease more than it would be like anything actually like, substantial.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think I feel like obviously these points that I had written down are kind of like merging into one, which I think is how I thought it was going to go. But basically, obviously, one of the discussion points was how well do we think it works within the format. I feel like one of the things that I wrote down, like you touched on there, is like momentum. I feel like obviously there's horror's a weird one because I feel like it works best when there are these kind of moments of like peace, if you will.
Yeah.
Because those moments give you a little bit of respite, and then you think that you're fine, and then so the scares are just it's almost like, I don't want to say like recharging because that sounds ridiculous, but do you know what I mean? Like you you get just a wee moment to reset, and then you're like, right, okay, this is. It's also such a good opportunity to have like to like scare your audience, because you could be like, this is like a moment where it's daylight outside. Historically in horror, that's always a safe place. So it's daylight and it's quiet and whatnot, and then that's such a good moment for something to happen. But I've completely lost the thread of my point here. But
Sorry.
it's fine. No, like yeah. So I feel like the issue with TV could potentially be that there's so many of these moments of like peace that it's almost like jarring that you jump from one to the other, from it being like daylight and peaceful and nighttime and scary, and then again that's gonna get really old really quickly. So like if you think like horror movie cliches are a thing because they happen so often that you know that something's gonna happen, so it's not scary.
Yeah.
And if you're watching 10 hours straight of a show where they've got like this format where they're like, this is safe, this is not safe, and then you're watching it, you're gonna get bored. Basically, you're gonna expect the scares when they appear, and yeah, and then it's a weird one, because even when they don't do that, and even when they scare you, it's generally a jump scare. That's like the easiest way.
Mm-hmm.
And then that just kind of cheapens it a wee bit. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are good jump scares, obviously.
Yeah.
They're a thing for a reason. But I feel like there's a lot of maybe like scope to almost be a little bit lazier somehow with TV. Like, I don't know, I just feel like I'm still going on this rambling point, and I'm not sure what my point is anymore.
I mean, the one thing that I've kind of noticed with like horror shows that I've watched recently, I mean, or just watching, I think, a bunch together, has kind of, again, it's like highlighted like certain things that occur across all of them, like certain just like patterns, and again, it must just be down to the format rather than because it's not a stylistic thing. Those are things that are made by different like productions and like different countries, and I think one thing that I noticed is they're just not like, they actually tend to be scary a lot less of the time, I feel. There tends to actually be a lot less horror despite there being more like overall content. There's definitely stuff that I've been watching recently, and I've just been like sitting there and I'm like, man, this these scary bits are like few and far between, and this is supposed to be a horror show.
That's such a good point.
But again, I think with it being a TV show, what TV shows use to kind of keep you coming back and keep you like paying attention is like characters, and like the sort of like the depth of character and the development of character, and the sort of dynamics that like fall around them. And so I think what happens is like TV kind of slips into being a drama, again with just like a lot of horror elements and sort of stylings, like a horror sort of esque score and like lighting and cinematography and stuff. So it's still, overall, you're like, yeah, that's a horror show. But when if you actually are like kind of analyzing it in any way, you're like, actually, there's not really that much horror. There's a lot more like of the sort of interpersonal drama than there is of like the scary stuff. Which again, I think that's, I guess, also part of like, to me, the sort of teething problems where I feel like it hasn't really figured out how to do both, how to sort of like wind the tension and keep it being scary. And I think, like you say, you will get like a lot of jump scares where it will swing from like, it'll be like dramatic scene, and then it'll be like, oh, we've not done horror for a bit, here's a jump scare.
Yeah,
and it just
exactly.
And I think it feels like they do that so that they're like, oh, now you can be scared anytime because you never know when one's coming, but it's really, that's not how it works.
Yeah. That's such a good point, because I feel like I don't know what's going on with me today, honestly. No, that's what I was going to say. Like, it very much slips into TV kind of format and tropes where, like we were talking about last time with cliffhangers, I feel like the kind of like penultimate episodes are going to be the scariest because they're setting up all these really terrifying things for it then to be kind of like resolved in the final episodes. And particularly in the examples that I've kind of watched, that tends to be how it goes.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that way, it definitely veers far more towards TV than like the kind of good aspects of what makes a horror movie scary. What are your thoughts? This wasn't in my notes, so I'd apologise for ambushing you for it. What are your thoughts on horror like TV endings, do you think they should wrap everything up? Or do you think there should be like a kind of note of hope, or do you think they're better when they're just depressing and hopeless? And what do you think?
That's a great question, and actually it does kind of connect to one of the points. Just talking about horror TV and just talking about horror. I mean, I mentioned before that that I feel like the format of TV brings to light the sort of flaws and the sort of weaknesses of the genre, and I think similar to comedy again. I'm talking about comedy a lot this podcast.
I think it's weird because there's like, I feel like there's always, in a good horror there tends to be like elements of comedy as well.
Yeah.
But maybe that's just, especially like British ones, just our horrible sense of humour.
Yeah, true. No, but there is definitely a link. I mean, look at Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
Who obviously came from like comedy to going straight into horror, and I think that you do tend to find people that are good at comedy can be very good at horror. Yeah, Stephen Moffat is another one who has some really like bleak parts in his writing, but also like established himself in sitcom. And yeah, anyway, the point that I was going to make is I feel like the connection is that they struggle a lot with like endings and wrapping things up, and I think horrors generally are more interesting at the start because like there's a lot more mystery and tension, and when it has to actually provide some sort of like payoff and some sort of like it has to try and like tie everything up and leave things in a satisfying way. Yeah, sometimes it does mean that you escalate. Like, again, look at something like The Shining, which escalates things like brilliantly. But there are like horror films out there that again, Alien's another one. Probably something that's like quite simple and straightforward and just has something chasing you is gonna get like more tense towards the end and is more likely to kind of like have quite a strong like last act. But then you have something like I'd say like Us, the Jordan Peele film, way more interesting in like the first 2/3 than it is in the last. And it's because it's it's got all these like intriguing ideas and like it has all these questions. And then when it kind of has to start like when you have to start answering those things in some way, you then have like exposition conflicting with like tension, and you kind of run the risk of revealing too much or making people think too much about the wrong things. And I think it gets very tough, and I think horror endings in particular are really, really difficult to do. There's so many. How many of them just end with like a jump scare or like
or like the classic like hand coming out of a grave, like the person you thought was dead, it might not actually be dead.
That's it. It's always like you think you're safe from the horror, but the horror's still here, and it has to end on that note. And I think even the best horrors, I think there's very few that have like that completely nail their endings. And I think the interesting thing is you can do it really well both ways. Like for example, Hereditary has a very, very bleak ending, and that's perfect for that film. Alien has a happy ending for the most part. I mean, most people are still dead. But
the
like
one person who's still alive, and the cat.
Yeah, and the cat. Ripley and Jones do make it off safe, and the movie does actually end on a note of like, okay, the danger's over, which I appreciate, and it doesn't take anything away from the film. I think it makes it quite a satisfying film. And then you have something like The Thing, which is pretty much in between, where like it's ambiguous whether it's a good ending or a bad ending. So again, those are maybe like three of the best examples of like horrors with like strong endings. So I think to get back to what you asked, I think it very much depends on the horror, but on the show, on like the story they're telling, and the danger and the whole world. There's so many elements that I think should inform exactly how things should be wrapped up. I don't think there is a right answer. Again, I think there should always be like an element of surprise, but I think it is tough. I would say maybe a good rule of thumb, and I don't actually know if there's like tons of horror shows that I can think of that do this. And I guess it's because they're shows, and again, it kind of goes against being shows. Is one thing I would be nice to see a bit more of is like if by the end there was a few fewer characters left. Like horror movies, like again, like we just discussed with Alien and The Thing, and Hereditary in particular. There's like not a lot of people left standing by the end, and it does make you feel like okay, like there's been a toll exacted, and that like I think that's what makes them rewatchable as well, because you're like okay, like this horror is going to dial things up and it's going to go places, and there are like genuine stakes. I think when you watch 10 hours of like things being creepy and people being in danger, but then like by hour 10 you've lost like two characters. You're a bit like,
Yeah, and they're two minor characters who were introduced 10 minutes before they died.
exactly. And if they do kill off a character, it's probably going to be in some like, melodramatic, emotional way rather
Yeah.
than like a horror, horrifying like death. So yeah, I think there's all these problems, and I think again it very much depends on the show, and what the story they're trying to tell us, and what sort of tone they're trying to strike as well. But yeah, I didn't really answer your question.
It's okay. I didn't even. I don't. I also don't have an answer for it. I was just curious. I feel like it was such an interesting points that you were making because I'm trying to. I'm thinking of my examples of shows that like I enjoyed and things, and a lot of them have this kind of like just this little nice like wrap it up. It's almost a happy ending but twisted slightly. So,
Yeah.
like for example, the first season of American Horror Story, where basically everyone is dead, but luckily everyone died in the house, so they're all still together and they've got this kind of happy family. So yeah, everyone died, but their life was actually better than it was before. And I just feel like I don't know. I feel like you're saying, it does depend on what you've been watching, what the kind of tone and the theme throughout is. But if you've been watching 10 hours of a horror and then everything is fine at the end, exactly like you were saying, like all the characters are still alive, or if they're dead, it doesn't make any difference that they're dead. Yeah, it feels almost like not quite a waste of time, but almost like you've been cheated out of something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very good point. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for asking the question, because yeah, it got me thinking. And yeah, I think like you say, I guess yeah, the tendency that TV shows have, isn't it, is either to, okay, if it's like a contained thing, then they'll want to give some like, I guess like they want to give like emotional payoff, and they want you to feel not to feel like you've been cheated. And if it's something that maybe wants to run longer, then it's going to end on a sort of cliffhanger, that it wants you to like pursue. So, and I guess the cliffhanger does kind of fit in a sense. You could argue a lot of horror movies, again, like we were saying, end on that final scare, so they do kind of end on a cliffhanger. So that does, I guess, fit the genre in a lot of ways. But I think the emotional payoff thing, again, you get horror movies that do have sort of payoffs, and yeah, but it generally is like quite subtle, I think, and quite like cleverly delivered rather than being this like big melodramatic thing. But I think because these horror shows are like kind of dramas first and foremost, they then do fall into the trap of having like these more melodramatic payoffs because they've been more melodramatic all the way through.
Yeah, that's right. No, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we'll just get into the nitty gritty and discuss any favourite TV shows we had. Because I know that you said before the podcast you hadn't really watched a huge amount, and then you crammed them all in that 2-week period, which I appreciate. So from that, did you have any favourites? What were they?
Yeah, so yeah, I did say that I'd not seen many. I did. That's the thing. Like, there's horrors. There's shows that I've seen that have horror elements. But I feel like that's not quite the same thing. And you have shows like Black Mirror and like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I think, that do have like, there's definitely like episodes of those shows that feel like full blown horror. And I really like those episodes. Those tend to be like sort of my favourite ones. Because I just love the genre, and I love when like things play around with it. And with something like Buffy as well, like I think it will take like a really cool idea, and Doctor Who's on the show will do this. It'll take like a really cool, creepy idea, and then just have like a one episode story about it. And I think the idea doesn't get stale that way. And again,
I feel like that's such a good way to do it, because you're kind of like we spoke about before, you're kind of like ambushed by it almost, and that makes it scarier because you weren't, especially with a TV show like Buffy that you up until that point you've been watching for a while, so you think you know what the kind of format is, and then it surprises you with that. It's always good. It's always fun.
Exactly. And I think again that's one thing that I do feel like horror suffers from as well. With regards to TV versus movies, I think horror movies have like so many great ideas because they can take an idea and make a movie out of it, whereas like it's harder to do that with a TV show. And again, a lot of like the sort of high concept horror movies do kind of like struggle towards the end, and I think like that's like a 2 hour or an hour and a half long film, never mind like a 10-hour show.
Yeah.
Whereas I think like shows like Buffy and Black Mirror that will take like an idea and be like, okay, we're gonna build like one like 45-minute episode out of this. It then works a lot stronger because like it gets to go through all, because again like horror tropes kind of exist for a reason. There's a reason we still have like haunted house stories that start with like a door creaking and things moving about. You don't just go straight into like the ghosts, even though you've seen all this stuff before. We still follow the same like pattern because like at the end of the day, there's only so far that you can push things, and you do kind of, a big part of it is like building tension. But I think when you have like an interesting idea and you can explore that, you can get into the more interesting stuff a lot quicker and like doing like an hour and a half long horror movie in 45 minutes if it's done well. I guess the in that situation, the advantage a show like Buffy has is that it's already got established characters, so it can kind of
you don't need to waste any time setting anything up really.
Exactly. You maybe have like a minor character or something that you're going to introduce, probably so you can kill them off. But generally you have your cast, so you can just get straight into like the creepy and actually build from there. So I think in those cases it's quite successful. One show that I'd actually came across that I'd forgotten, I always forget exists, annoyingly I've not even finished it. I've only seen like the first season and a little bit of the second. There's only 2 seasons, so I really do need to get back on it. But it's one of the best things I've ever seen, or one of the things that I've like appreciated the most. So it's weird that I've not like watched more of it. I don't know if you'll have seen it or heard of it. It's a French show called Les Revenants.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it. I do like me some French. Yeah. I feel like I don't think I've seen very much French horror.
So they showed it on Channel 4. Like this, it came out like 9 years ago, and I think my mum must have maybe the one, 'cause I watched the first. I think I watched it with her, so she must have been the one to have heard about it and suggested putting it on. She loves foreign films, but I don't really know what the deal was there and why Channel 4 ended up like broadcasting it. They did a really cool thing actually, where during the ad breaks, it was only the first episode they did this, but during the ad breaks, all the adverts were in French.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, which just was another, because I think the thing that I love about it so much is it has such a good tone. It's so like, it just has like such a specific mood and vibe and atmosphere, that I think like it just that to me, because I remember thinking about it and it's like there's stuff in it. There's this one character, I think he's called Victor, and he's just this little kid. And he kind of just like, in the first episode anyway, he kind of just like cuts about and doesn't really do anything, except like, I think he just like finds this woman and like kind of starts following her, and he doesn't, that's the thing, he's not actually doing anything, but I remember like finishing that first episode and Mom was just like, that kid was terrifying, and it's so interesting because it's just like, you're like, he's not actually done anything, but there's just like this constant fear and this constant implication. Obviously, a lot of that's to do with like things that we discussed, like cinematography and score, and just like the general like. But the show has a lot of that, a lot of this like, it's just like dripping in atmosphere, and there is just a really sort of haunted, creepy feel, where you just like it more than anything else. I think managed. I think a really big part of that is the fact that it's like a French show. It's like in a different language, because I think that does. I think it makes it feel, well, it literally makes it feel foreign, but it makes it feel, there's just like an otherworldly nature to it, and I think it's like set in the Alps and stuff. Funnily enough, when I lived in the Alps, the hotel that I worked in, the theme for that show came on.
Oh no.
Which was, it's a really nice, it's actually a really
Were you like looking around to see if anyone else could hear it, or if it was just you?
It's just me. Funnily enough as well, it's Mogwai that composed they did the score for it.
Oh yeah?
Who are Scottish. I think they're Glaswegian. So yeah, I don't think they'd even seen the whole show. I think they only, sorry, this is becoming a return podcast. I don't think they'd even seen the whole show. I think they'd only seen a couple of episodes and wrote like the score. The score's phenomenal for it. But yeah, that to me was a show that did a really good job of, it was just very, I mean, even like, I think even in terms of like the characters, there was like sort of interpersonal dramas, but the premise of it is what lent to that being really interesting, and the way that it was written was quite conservative in terms of like dialogue and things like that. So it was a very like, there wasn't like tons of like conversations happening. There was just a lot of like tone and atmosphere and a lot of like guesswork. So you're watching this thing unfold, and there were like twists and turns and stuff, to sort of keep you like coming back. But at the same time, I think a lot of it was, I think it left so much to your imagination. I think that was why it was so strong. I think that's part of the reason I've not gone and watched the second series, because I'm like, I need to be in the right frame of mind for this, because it's so good. And I'm also a little bit scared, because I don't know if season 2, because season 1 finished, and I remember being annoyed at the time, because I was like, there's so much that just didn't like clear up at all. It like raises so many questions and answers next to none of them, which was really frustrating. And I don't know if it was intended to just be a 2 series thing and series 2 wraps things up, or if it's one of those things that was like unfortunately cancelled, like poor Westworld was.
Don't even get me started on that. Honestly, you sent me the link, I clicked on it, and I was like,
honestly, it keeps coming up in my feed every single time I get like upset about it.
It is upsetting.
But yeah, so that's one that I would really recommend, and it's one that I will go back and finish eventually, maybe for the podcast, because it would make for an interesting discussion, I think, and I think you'd like it. Other ones that I've seen, so again, the obvious one that I'll mention, that I've watched recently that I really liked is The Devil's Hour, which stars Peter Capaldi. I really like that because, and it's not again, I'd say it's not just a horror. It's kind of like a police procedural, and a horror, and there's again a couple more, or at least one more genre in there, that I won't really mention because like I'd say it's kind of spoilery.
Yeah, I've seen 3 episodes so far.
Okay, nice. What are your thoughts on it so far?
I really like it. Similar to you, like what you were just saying, it's got this kind of like element where you're trying to play along and you're trying to figure out what's happening as it's going, but like, and the more you try and figure out, the more confusing it gets, and the different things crop up. And similar to that French one that you were talking about, actually, I find it's funny that they both have this kind of creepy child like a theme going through it. I feel like it's such a funny horror trope, this idea of children being creepy AF.
Yeah.
And Isaac in The Devil's Hour does it so well. Like, props to that wee boy. He's just out there being just a creep.
yeah, and I think we've talked before, but obviously you not being a fan of child actors, and again there can be very like very hit and miss, more on the miss side. But yeah, I think that show handles that quite well by making it almost about the fact that like
I kind of like love this idea that like everyone knows that he's weird and that he's quite creepy, including his mum.
Yeah.
And she's like, I'm trying my best. Like, you need to give me something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing that hit me with the first episode of that is there's some really great like imagery, and it does all these like interesting things to sort of like, you don't really know what's going on, but it does set a really good tone, and does a really good job of sort of jumping between different characters, and sort of like there's like a non-linearity to it as well, that keeps you sort of interested, but it means that it can do a lot more. It feels like quite a clever way to make the show, because it it feels like it's injected a lot more horror in what could have been quite a non-horror premise. Again, it could have just been more sort of police procedurally, and less of like the out and out horror, but I think there's a lot of like effective horror imagery and horror ideas, that's quite cool to see. So, and I think it's quite good at, for me, I was really enjoying watching it, because it's just really good at like throwing questions at you, and it will start to explain things, but in like, again, ways that you don't expect, and it's a really just the way that it's, the format of it is quite nice for it like constantly ticking over, and you always sort of being pulled towards the next scene, and there is a nice sort of like, it does feel like it's dialing up the tension and making things creepier and more interesting. So yeah, that's one that I've very much dug with. I think as well, Peter Capaldi's just right at home with being a bit creepy.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like one thing I wanted to mention about this show as well is that it's got kind of, like you were talking about before, it's got kind of this like, I wouldn't describe it as fun to watch. Like when you're watching it, you do have this kind of like almost heavy, kind of uneasy feeling, but I feel like that works really well. It kind of adds to the confusion of the show, because you don't really, there's nothing like, in the episodes that I've seen anyway, there's nothing like out and out horror in like the most horrifying sense. Like I've seen a lot worse. But it does kind of leave you with that like I was saying, like a heavy feeling where you're like, oh god, this is a lot is going on here. So I'm excited. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm excited to keep going. How many episodes are there? Do you know?
Only 6, so
Only
you're
6?
halfway through. Yeah. One thing I thought was quite funny was because I remember you mentioning that you'd watched the first, and again we obviously just did a discussion on like cliffhangers and conclusions, but I thought that did a really good cliffhanger and conclusion between the first 2 episodes, where you think that this woman and her kid have been killed by like the ex, and then at the start of the next episode you find out he's been killed. And that's a really good, that to me was a really clever way of being like, okay, we're going to leave that as a cliffhanger and then immediately like turn that into something else. And it also felt like it turned it from something that was a bit of almost slightly cliched into something a bit more interesting.
Yep.
And again, I think the show is quite good at doing that, taking things that like are slightly cliched and like putting a new spin on it. So yeah,
like,
no.
One thing, sorry, just very quickly, and
okay.
it's nothing to do. It's no fault of the show's. It's that I saw a bloody advert for the show, and before I could even like change the channel or stop watching it, it was like I'm pretty sure potentially what the other genre is that you were talking about, and it's infuriating that it was spoiled. Yeah.
That is very infuriating because it's so much of the fun of it is like just watching everything like unfold.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very annoying. I came very close to, there was like a couple on Instagram, I think, a couple of ads that came up to it, and straight away I was just like, nope.
Yep.
I don't want to see anything. And weirdly enough, this is like, I think this is the only show I've watched this year, where, because I think I complained to you about this before, definitely complained to loads of people about this before, where like any show that I'm watching or like have an interest in watching, just because of life, I'm not able to watch things as they like drop, basically.
Yeah.
There's very, very few things that, I don't think there's anything I can really like do that with. I did it with the finale of Better Call Saul, and I went out of my way to do that. Like I literally went into work an hour early so that I could then take an hour's break when the episode dropped online and watch it. So yeah, it's near impossible to. And every show that I watch, I always just see like posts about online, and like it's just like the internet just throws spoilers at me.
100%. Like if you're watching a new show, you can't even speak the name aloud, or you'll be getting spoilers on your phone.
Exactly. But weirdly enough, with The Devil's Hour, apart from those like couple adverts on Instagram, I saw nothing on social media. But almost the second I finished the last episode, I went on Twitter, and one of the first posts was about The Devil's Hour and had spoilers in it, and I was like, that is insane, the timing of that.
Yeah, that's infuriating.
There was another really creepy moment as well when I watched it, and this is like nothing to do, this is just like a weird thing that happened in just like the universe. I was watching the 5th episode, and it's called After the Storm, and I was watching it was like getting towards the end of the episode, and just every other episode I'd watched, I think I'd like clocked the name of before I'd like watched the episode. And I realised just in my head, it popped into my head as the episode was like wrapping up, I was like, what is this one called? I was like, I don't know what the 5th episode's called. I was like, it doesn't really matter, but I was like, I just now that it's like coming to my head, I kind of need to know. So I was either on my laptop or on like a TV, so I like hit the mouse or whatever, just so that the name icon would come up. And the bar dropped down at the exact instant the character on the show said a line, which was the name of the episode, said the words After the Storm. It was really, really weird. Like, it was one of those things that I was like, I wish I hadn't been alone for that, because that was just like so bizarrely synchronized. But yeah, I've gone off on a massive tangent there, so apologies.
That's fine.
There's one other show I want to talk about, but I will hold off for a second about talking about it and ask you, what are yours? What are your favourites?
So one of mine, obviously, I feel like anyone I've ever spoken to in my life, I've probably spoken to about this show. And that's a Haunting of Hill House. And obviously you haven't seen it yet, so I'm not gonna make any spoilers or anything. I'll be very vague.
Is this the first time you've actually mentioned this show on this podcast?
On the podcast? Surely not.
I think it might be. I actually don't. I think, despite the fact that you love it so much, I can't think of any time where you've referenced it, not properly anyway. And we're 17 episodes in.
I know.
So that's impressive.
Yeah.
I know exactly.
Fair. That's because it deserves its own podcast. Maybe that's why I've just been sitting on it.
Yeah, fair.
But this is one of the kind of first ones that I really remember watching and then kind of like actively seeking out horror TV shows. Obviously, like we said, I've always enjoyed horror. Well, not always enjoyed horror, but recently I've really enjoyed horror. I feel like you were talking about, it kind of takes this cliche of the haunted house and elevates it, I would say. It kind of elevates it. It breathes new life into it. Obviously, it was based on a book, but from things that I've read, Mike Flanagan, the creator, has like tweaked it and created characters and things like that. So just to make it more interesting. I feel like one thing it does really well is that the pacing throughout is pretty on point. I feel like it's quite consistently scary. There are elements similar to in the movie Halloween, where there's this kind of idea you're maybe not as conscious of it or you're not aware of it, but there's this underlying feeling that there's this kind of ever-present danger.
Yeah.
But you can't, it's not obvious, it's not at the forefront. Mike Flanagan kind of does this, he uses a lot. Again, like we were speaking about the What Makes Horror Scary podcast, he uses a lot of like the background and kind of negative space in that to make it really scary. It's really fun as well. I feel like it's a good watch even after you've watched it, like when you're reading about it and then when you think back to it or when you rewatch it, it definitely benefits from that.
Yeah.
And it also has one of the best jump scares in horror. I feel, I wouldn't say any more than that, but I literally almost fell off the couch when I was watching it.
Fair enough.
It's so good. So
Fair.
when you do watch it, we'll need to discuss, because there's no way you're gonna miss it.
No, I won't. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm very looking forward to it. Like I said to you, I'm halfway through Midnight Mass just now, which is utterly fantastic, by the way. Like I am really, really loving it, and yeah, it does fall slightly into the trap that I was talking about of like being a drama more than a horror, but it still has those like horror elements and stuff, and it does still do the horror stuff well, but it like, again, I am aware, I'm like, wow, there's some really long scenes of people talking and they're beautifully written and acted and they're like making a point, so I'm not complaining, but like looking at it analytically from like about to do a podcast on horror TV, I'm like, you're not giving me as much to work with here as I'd like you to.
Yep, definitely. I feel like Hill House has that, where the underlying story is obviously about the family, but I feel like there's so much horror packed in there, and like I said, it's one of those shows that really like ramps up the tension and almost maintains it throughout. So like even when there doesn't appear to be anything scary happening, you're kind of like uneasy. I feel like it felt a bit different to other, maybe like, because horror went through a period of time where it was just not great, and then when we're kind of coming out of that, obviously the very first video we did on the podcast was a video essay about like the kind of resurgence of horror, so kind of coming out of that and then watching a TV show like this, it was, like I said, it just is like a breath of fresh air almost for horror, something a bit different. Saying that, I noticed that all of my choices here are very different in terms of the horror that they kind of present. Another one, obviously, how could I go without mentioning American Horror Story? I know you're not a fan, but I feel like it's so different. It's got like this kind of almost like whimsical quality to it, where I feel like a lot of horror you need to take not as seriously. Sometimes horror is a bit of fun, and I feel like American Horror Story really leans into that. So a lot of that is pretty fun to watch, even though there are moments that are pretty grim. Obviously The Devil's Hour, which I'm excited to finish, that we've spoken about, and then I assume this is the one that you haven't spoken about yet, and that is The Cabinet of Curiosities.
Yes, indeed.
So I've only seen 2 episodes, but I feel like it's obviously an anthology, and I feel like that's such a good, it's so well suited to horror, because like we were saying, a horror story can be like 2 lines long. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Everyone's read those horror stories, so it can work really well in a format that's 2 minutes, 20 minutes, do you know what I mean, 40 minutes up to an hour. I feel like as well, my takeaway from this is we've spoken about Del Toro before, and he's so good at like monsters and
Yeah.
somehow present. He like it's weird because he does like monsters, but they're also like his movies are so like you would argue like beautiful. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
I
obviously
think.
he hasn't
Sorry.
like he hasn't. I've only seen 2 episodes. Obviously, the first was written. The first story was written by him, but the second one wasn't. But I feel like there's such like that specific feel of something that he's attached to, which is obviously why I had an issue with in a previous podcast when we were talking about scary stories to tell in the dark. I had an issue with that because it just didn't. His name was all over it, but it just didn't feel like his.
Yeah.
Where I feel like the 2 episodes that I've seen of Cabinet of Curiosities genuinely does feel like his really like unique way of horror movie monsters as well. I also feel like the second one obviously was the Graveyard Rats. That was a lot. There was a lot happening there. I feel like there was one point in particular when there was just one particular imagery that was absolutely horrifying, and to describe it, it's not even that scary. Like there are obviously elements that were very obviously scary.
What's the imagery you're talking about?
It's when he's opened the grave and the body of the man is being dragged backwards out of the grave. That was horrifying. I remember like vocally being like, "Oh god, that was really scary." And it's something like it doesn't sound massively scary, but it's that thing again that horror does so well, where you can't. At this point, we couldn't see what was dragging it, and it was obviously big enough to drag a grown man from a grave. Oh, scary. Even just thinking about it now is giving me the fear.
Graveyard. Did you watch it in colour or black and white? Out of curiosity, Graveyard Rats.
I think it was. It wasn't. I do remember thinking, God, this is not very. Like I thought it was quite monochromatic, but it didn't occur to me until right now.
Because the only reason I'm asking because I didn't realise I saw this on social media after watching it. But I was still watching like the show, but I'd seen that episode and the creator, I think it was the guy that directed it, tweeted saying that I think you maybe have to go into the settings, or no, I think it's maybe down with like the trailer, so I don't think it's like listed as the episode, but I think it's like listed further down under like more or something. But there's like a black and white version of the episode, and I was just curious.
It definitely wasn't black and white because I remember the jewellery being very gold, but it was very muted, the colours.
It's just a very drab palette.
Yeah.
It's just curious because I didn't know if you were aware of it or not. But yeah, I would have been curious to see it in black and white just to see, just because I feel like it would add to the tone. Of that one in particular, and it's just I like the fact that there is definitely they do very much play around with styles and formats. I mean, having different directors and different writers for like every episode, I think obviously does that. But yeah, I mean, I've seen them all. I've seen all 8 episodes. Funnily enough, and I'm a huge Del Toro fan. I didn't love the series.
Okay.
There are standout episodes. There's one in particular that I absolutely loved. I don't think you will.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not saying you won't like it. But it's very particular in its style. And it's one of the reasons that I watched the show, or wanted to watch the show, was because I knew that the guy who wrote and directed it was doing an episode, and he'd done a movie that I've seen that I absolutely love. And yeah, I was just very curious to see what he was going to do with this, and I was not disappointed. If I could scrub my eyes and watch it fresh all over again, I would so love to, because I enjoyed it so much. But yeah, it's very like particular. So I'm not gonna say what episode it is. I'm not gonna say anything about it. I'm just gonna wait because you'll know it when you see it, and I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts. But yeah, there's that one, and then the finale I thought was really interesting, which is by Jennifer Kent, I think she's called, who is the director and I think writer as well of The Babadook.
Yes, I do know when you said her name, then I was like racking my brains to think where I'd heard it before.
And it stars Essie Davis, who was also in The Babadook, and our boy Andrew Lincoln as well from The Walking Dead.
Oh, okay.
So that one was an interesting one because I also wasn't loving it for tons of it, because it's quite slow. But there's the thing that I really appreciated about it is it doesn't over explain things. It very much leaves you to kind of like put pieces together yourself, and there is a more sort of like, I don't want to say more mature tale being told, but there is a more mature tale being told than like some of the other ones, which kind of feel like they just exist to be sort of spooky and creepy. Whereas it felt like that had something it kind of wanted to say in its own way. And yeah, it just was quite. I like the fact that it by the end of it you're thinking about it a lot more. I think Cabinet of Curiosities kind of disappointed me with. I'd wanted a bit more from them all. I felt like it was a lot more repetitive than I kind of thought it would. Yeah, and even like.
That's funny because I watched the first episode. Obviously, that the story is by Del Toro, and I watched it and I finished watching it and I was like, like I was a little bit disappointed.
Yeah.
So I kind of get what you mean. I've obviously seen 2 episodes, but
that was. I mean, the first one in particular was one where I was like, man, there ain't a lot of horror happening in this horror show. Like a lot of it really was.
Yeah, like this is an episode of Storage Wars at this point.
Yeah, it genuinely is though. Like it pretty much is just like him, like and there's obviously like there's some creepy stuff going on, but when you're watching something that you know is like less than an hour long, you're a bit like, oh, you you made the point. Like you can start being creepy now. I mean, the first 2 episodes you could in many ways share a lot of the same DNA. A few of the other ones I think share the same sort of DNA, without spoiling anything. But first 2 episodes are kind of like morally the same message, which is just like don't rob dead people. Bad things will happen. And I think there is a bit of like, I think one thing that I didn't love about it was there tends to be a slight over-reliance, and I say slight over-reliance, there's usually like a moment in each episode, but it's in like pretty much every episode, which kind of relies on like more grotesque horror rather than actually being creepy. And grotesque horror can work. Again, we were talking about The Thing before, and that has like a lot of like grotesque horror, but I think it does it so effectively because it's like, I think because it's showing you like just how horrific and alien this like creature is. Yeah, because really it's doing it to itself for the most part. Like, you talk about like the dog's face peeling off at the start, and that's terrifying because you're like that's how it just like operates normally. And that's what's so chilling about it. Whereas like Cabinet of Curiosities will have, again, maybe a scene of like the guy like pulling teeth out of a dead body, or the opening with the guy cutting up like the meat, and it's just like focusing on all the squelchy sounds, and it's like it's trying to make you uncomfortable just by being a bit gross, and it just feels a bit cheap to me.
No, that's fair.
And yeah, it happens in a lot of the episodes where there'll be like moments or like several moments of like, oh, isn't this like disgusting? And I'm just like, I'd like a bit more like atmosphere and imagination where like the scares are concerned. And I think with like it being different directors, different writers, and completely different stories, I expected a bit more from that. I thought it would be a bit more like interesting.
That's such a good point, because I feel like there's such a, like, funnily enough, like we were talking about the Thing, that's an exceptionally like a movie full of body horror, but then like so it was me and my bestie went to see it, and she was fine the entire way through. The dog's face was getting peeled open, she was fine, and then there was one point where they like had to cut their thumbs and started bleeding, and she felt sick. Like, I feel like having intentional gore like that is in a show or whatever that's not like a kind of torture porn. It's because people who are squeamish don't watch torture porn, do you know what I mean? But they might still like horror, and then they're trying to watch a horror show and there's this needless kind of horrible gore element. It's a bit weird, that one. I never thought of that before. Yeah,
I think it's just a little bit on the gratuitous side and a little bit on the cheap side. But yeah, no, I think I'm a bit disappointed by it, but at the same time, I'm glad it exists, and it's the sort of thing that I would like to see more of. I'd like to see. I'd like to see more like anthology horror series, because I do think there's a lot of potential, and I think a couple of the episodes do hit it, but and there's other ones as well that like I liked, but I just overall the batting average for me was quite low.
Okay.
which is a shame. But again, that's why I was interested. I didn't want to say anything to you, and I know that I have, but I was saying to you before going into the podcast to discuss it, just because I was genuinely curious of like your subjective opinion on it, and I'm curious what your opinion will be in the rest. And that's also why I'm not saying. Obviously, I mentioned like the one of the episodes in particular.
That's so funny because I was going to ask you what your favourite episode was. So we'll need to wait until I've watched it.
Yeah, no, I look forward to hearing your thoughts. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of them, to be honest, because I think they all do merit discussion in their own way, and I have like things that I would say. There's one aspect of one episode in particular that I know you'll have something to say about, and I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, now I'm buzzing.
So on that note, then, I was gonna say.
Were you going to take over and start hosting?
I was going to take over. Yeah, I don't know why. I just going
You're
into
so
autopilot.
used to it now, like.
Hey, I saw a segue and I jumped to it. Okay.
Fair. No, on that note.
I had more to say about horror shows that I like, to be honest.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah, so is there any, obviously you've kind of mentioned the Cabinet one, but is there any other ones that you didn't enjoy? There's one that I know that you've watched that you haven't mentioned, so I know that there's definitely one.
Would that be The Walking Dead?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I know. I think that really is the epitome of like, it's just so weak when it comes to like horror. And again, I think zombies in general are like very weak fodder for horror. Because it's, and we have discussed this before on the podcast with like, there's just not really much to them that lends themselves to. Again, when I was talking about The Returned and how effective that is at like using your imagination and sort of like concepts and making you think and guess and you talked about Hill House and how you're sort of like looking at the edge of the frame and you don't really know what's like going on, and you know that there's this feeling there's always sort of some danger there, but you never know when it's going to like strike or whatever. And zombie shows, and The Walking Dead in particular, try to do that. Well, they'll have like unexpected like walker attack, but it's always
silent zombies up until the moment we see them.
Yeah, always just feels contrived. Always feels like a written thing. It never feels like they've just happened to make this mistake, or like they messed up. Every single time you're like, there's one thing that you need to be aware about all the time, and that's those zombies. So if they ever get the drop on you, like I think maybe it'd be more forgivable if we had a zombie show that wasn't set in what looked like a zombie apocalypse. But when the world itself is a constant reminder of the danger that you're in, then it becomes a bit unforgivable to forget about the danger that you're in.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I feel like you would never have a single moment of peace if you knew there were zombies roaming about. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. You definitely wouldn't be getting into like arguments or like deep heart to hearts in a place where you're in danger. There's just, especially not if you'd survived for as long as the people in the show had survived. Again, I could understand if it's like, even then, week one, you'd be on red alert the whole time. Yeah, there's no
excuse. 100%. I wouldn't be taking absolutely not a second out of my day to tell people that I love them or whatever. I'd be like, come with me. We're getting out of here.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the most horrifying ideas that The Walking Dead introduced and kind of put to use that I'd seen anyway was the whole one about the little girls. Was it Lizzie and
that was grim.
That was quite chilling. Quite chilling stuff. And even then, it was like quite, I feel like, restrained. They didn't really overdo it, and it was quite a nice sort of twist. It was kind of used more as like a dramatic thing than it was as like this is horrifying. And I think that's why it works, because I think if The Walking Dead had tried to play it as more of a horror concept, it would have done a really bad job of it. But I think that's one of the instances where it did kind of get some like cool horror stuff. And then there was other one was with Terminus that they ate people. That was like their whole thing.
Oh yeah.
But they only like the Terminus thing was like, they were on their way to Terminus for ages, and then they were there, and that was like the end of the season, and then the start of the next season was them like blowing up Terminus and leaving. So that one was over in a hurry. Which again,
When you said that there, I was like, what? What's Terminus again?
The only reason it stands in my head is because I remember in the lead up to them, them talking about Terminus and them like trying to find it and all that. I remember having friends that had like read the comics, and so they were like, "Oh, Terminus, they eat people." It was a very like built up thing, and then it was obviously that was the note that it ended on. That was the cliffhanger, and then when like the next season started and they just kind of wrapped it up immediately, it was like,
yeah, because Carol just comes in and blows up the joint, doesn't she?
And I kind of respect that about it, but again, it's like it's the show having like a really strong horror like thing going for it for once, and then just being like,
you could have explored that, like that's horrifying. Exactly. But no, they were like, no, we need to get back to the zombies. It's been 5 minutes since we've seen them, and everyone loves them. Such a crowd pleaser.
Exactly. Oh dear, it's called The Walking Dead, not The Eating Dead. Anyway, yeah, I think the only other one that I would mention as like specifically not liking is obviously American Horror Story, but we have talked like at length about that, and I don't have any like fresh take on that. I mean, I didn't really have another fresh take on The Walking Dead, but I've seen a lot more of that, so I've got more anger to like let loose there.
A lot more time invested and wasted, some would argue.
What about yourself?
So one of the ones for me was not that I hated it, but just that I didn't particularly enjoy it. And that was actually The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Okay.
And I feel like this is purely my own fault. I 100% ruined it for myself because for some reason I decided in my head that there was going to be some kind of crazy twist that had to do with like time travel. And I couldn't tell you why. But when it never happened, I was left feeling a little bit like, oh, like, what happened to that twist? And here's my justification for it. You've seen it, haven't you?
Yeah, I've seen it.
So my justification is that she, the kind of Vanny character, is very 80s. Like, she's got the hair and her clothes. Yeah. She looks like workout clothes. But everyone else seems like they're kind of like 50s, 60s era.
Mm-hmm.
And I still, to this day, am a little bit annoyed because I'm like, that was never addressed. Is she just dressed like that because... Is she American in the show? I can't remember. Yeah, she is.
Yeah, she is American in the show.
I'm like, is she just dressed like that because she's American and American people think that British people dress like this all the time and they think that we're, like, British people are very, like, prim and proper? I don't know. I'm still angry about it. So I feel like I definitely ruined that for myself. I also feel like, again, another me issue is that I'd hyped up Hill House in my head so much, and there was a fair wait between Hill House and Bly Manor, so that entire time I had kind of bigged it up and I was really excited for it, and then I watched it and I did enjoy it. There were some really good moments, but at the same time it felt very like there was something missing. So that was my issue with that.
That's fair. I when I watched it in like 2 sittings. I think I watched the first like half of it, or maybe the first like 2/3 with some friends, and then watched the last like third by myself. And I do remember kind of like if I hadn't watched it with people, I wouldn't have watched it all. Like I think I would have stopped after the first episode and just been like, nah, I'm good. Even after the first like 2. I think it took a while for me to really get on board the show, and obviously I hadn't seen Hill House. I'd heard good things. So going in and watching Bly Manor at the start, I was very disappointed. So I was like, okay, is this what all this hype's been about? I know it's a different show, but I assumed okay, this will also be really good. And I guess I thought it ended very strongly, and it obviously has that line where it says, well, it's a love story, not a ghost story, which I think was really interesting, and that kind of is it. It's not really. It does have horror elements, but again, that one like more honestly isn't actually a fully horror show. And I appreciated the fact that in that instance, I thought it did tell a sort of really nice story by the end. But like you say, it still did. I still, as much as I thought it like had some really strong episodes towards the end and tied things up quite nicely, I still can't. I still have to admit the fact that like I would have stopped watching the show. So,
pretty much like in my notes, I've basically written that it's not something that I would rush back to.
Yeah.
So that was slightly disappointing. Another one, I'm not sure if you've seen this show, but one of my choices was the show Hannibal.
I've only seen the first episode or so. So no, I've not really seen it.
I feel
I've heard
like
good things about Hannibal.
so have I, and then I watched it, and you could tell like visually it was stunning. There was some like amazing shots and things, but I just felt, I don't know, it felt like the gore felt very like gratuitous, like, but not, it was done in such a weird way. It wasn't something like Saw, but it was so gory that it was like
Yeah.
unsettling and not in a fun kind of way, and it was constantly, you were constantly being bombarded by it,
Yeah.
which made it quite difficult to watch, especially if you wanted to like binge watch it. And I feel like Silence of the Lambs is like probably top three of my favorite movies, and I'm so like weirdly precious about it that I don't like. Red Dragon's okay. I quite like Red Dragon, but I hate Hannibal. I can't even remember the third one. The one with Julianne Moore.
Is it Hannibal Rising?
Is it Hannibal Rising? I can't remember, but that one I hate it.
There is one that's just called Hannibal. Is it just Hannah?
It could be just Hannibal, and then the TV show's the same name, because Hannibal Rising is when he's young.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Hannibal was pretty sure Hannibal was directed by Ridley Scott as well.
He's such a weird director. Like, we need to do a podcast on him. What a weird
guy. We did an intervention on him, but yeah, the podcast first.
And yeah, obviously Anthony Hopkins is famous for that role, and I feel like Mads Mikkelsen does a very good job, but I don't know, I just feel like part of the intrigue with Hannibal is that you don't, especially in Silence of the Lambs, you don't really know him. You know his crimes, and you know that he's got this weird kind of code where he's polite, and like he makes Miggs, is that his name, kill himself because he's rude to Clarice. So I don't know, I feel like a lot of the best bits of Silence of the Lambs is that Hannibal's like, he's not the main part of the story. I'm sure Anthony Hopkins is only in it for like 12 minutes or something. So it makes sense that they would make a show purely based on him and his relationship to Hugh Dancy's character. I can't remember his name, but he's also the character that's in Red Dragon. Yeah, but I don't know, I feel like, I hate to say boring, but I definitely didn't, there was no, like, the episodes that I watched because I made myself watch them. Yeah. Not through any kind of like, oh my god, I'm absolutely buzzing to watch that and see what happens. It felt very like a kind of crime show that you've seen before, like a very classy, more in-depth CSI almost. So yeah, that was a shame. Another one based on an amazing movie, which we spoke about today actually, is Bates Motel. Have you ever seen it?
I've not, no. Funnily enough, I was thinking about it just in relation to this podcast, because I remember thinking, I was like, I just was thinking of like horror TV shows that I'm aware of, and I was like, it's interesting that there is one. That's another one I've heard good things about.
Potentially gets better with time, but I didn't give it that time to get any better.
Fair enough. I mean, I'd heard good things about like it from the start, so I thought it started out strong.
It's potentially maybe the same issue I've got with Hannibal, where I just like what I like. I'm like, don't mess with the classics. I feel like a lot of, like I've spoken before about, I have a major issue with like villain stories, like we spoke about it in context of Disney. I don't want to know why Cruella de Vil is the way that she is. Do you know what I mean? That obviously carries over into horror, where I'm like, I don't want to know, like Michael Myers, I don't want to know. It's scarier to me if he's just insane. Do you know what I mean? And or like, do you know what I mean? Just a psycho.
The less you know, the more that's the more that's left to your imagination, the more effective like those stories are, I think. Yeah. And the more it feels like, oh, Michael Myers could be coming to get me. But when you start filling in like these characters' lives, and it makes for like, again, it's a fascinating deep dive and stuff, but at the same time it does take away from the horror, because it's less of this like entity that just appears and like terrorizes people and then disappears into the night, and it's more of this like, oh well, I know his whole profile, like I know everything that he went through, so I know exactly the sort of people to avoid. And...
Yeah, exactly. It just feels like, because the like the scary thing about Psycho, for example, is that Norman Bates can target anyone. Do you know what I mean? Like there
Yeah.
seems to be no rhyme or reason. And then, like you're saying, you watch it and you discover all these traumas and things that he had, where you're like, oh, so clearly that's why he does that, and it definitely just takes away from the horror for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of one thing I wanted to speak about, which will bring us into the next point, and I obviously haven't seen enough of it, so you can be the judge of this one. But when I was googling things, Stranger Things came up quite a lot. Would you have classed
Yeah.
that as a horror show?
So I actually did put it down as, and like, yeah, I think I mentioned this before. I did have it listed, but just I was like, just in the interest of like time, I've talked enough about the other ones. I was like, I'll spare you the rant on Stranger Things because it kind of. I think the first series in particular, I think I have said this before in the podcast. One of the things I really liked about it was the horror element. You know, it felt like it mishmashed a lot of different things together. It was very like 80s nostalgia, but it basically was the one that kicked off the whole wave of like 80s nostalgia with Stranger Things, and it took obviously a lot of like Stephen King, you know, books and like elements and like had homages and stuff and like put them together. So there was like I thought there was a really nice like horror aspect to it. Like it kind of felt like, again, there was like a sort of ET element to it, but it was like a sort of Stephen King takes on like ET, and there's like yeah, there were like some genuine horror moments, and it felt like there were actual stakes. It felt like, you know, there were characters. I mean, it starts with like one of the main characters like disappearing, and then there are other characters that disappear and die throughout it, and that was what I really liked about it. Was it felt like there were moments where you were like, okay, this character's in danger, anything could happen, and then moving forward, seasons 2 and 3, I remember thinking, I was like, it just doesn't have the same. There's just not the same fear. There was maybe some moments of like effective horror in season 2, and then by season 3, I was like, it's kind of just gone. And I think a big part of that was like the success of the show, and that's another thing that, you know, shows kind of suffer from as well. Is like, you know, you have this like all-star kid cast, you know, who became massive because of the show, and they've ended up in other projects, but because obviously the show has been so successful around them, the show then can't really kill them off.
Yeah.
You know, if it were to kill them off, it would be in a really big way. It wouldn't just be like they're being chased by a monster and the monster gets them kind of thing. So
Yeah.
You then lose a lot of the horror. So yeah, like, but one thing I watched a masterclass done by the Duffer Brothers earlier in the year, and they talked about their approach to doing all the different seasons. And I watched this. I think the masterclass came out after season 4 had dropped. I watched it before season 4, before I'd seen season 4, and in it they talked about like their approach to every season and how like the first one, all the sort of things that I mentioned were like their touchstone, their reference points. They talked about how they had different reference points for like each season, and like season 3, for instance, was supposed to be more like a sort of like summer blockbuster, and it dropped in the summer, and it does have that kind of like vibrant colours and sort of feel, and it was more actiony, and that I thought was really interesting because I hadn't really thought about that before. The fact that they were taking on different genres, and they mentioned with season 4 the cast now being a bit more grown up, they can push things a bit further, and they've kind of gone down the horror route again with it. Again, it did still suffer from, I know these characters aren't really at risk,
Yeah.
but it does do a good job of having minor characters be at risk, and there's some just really nice horror ideas and imagery and sort of like homages to things like Nightmare on Elm Street, that I thought was really nicely done. So even though it wasn't like tense or sort of scary in the way that the first season was, there was still some like I thought quite compelling like horror stuff in there. Like I did like the fact that it did feel like it was the closest it's been to that tone. And I think having like heard them say that and realised that was their approach, I then had a lot more appreciation for it, because I was like, okay, that was like a more of a deliberate thing than I realised. It wasn't actually trying to strike that every single time. I just like noticed the absence of it because that was one of the things that I loved about that first season. So yeah, like yes and no, I would class it as a horror show. Definitely like more so than some, but not as much as others. But it's when it wants to be, it does have horror elements, and I think it can do them well. I think one thing I'm looking forward to about the last season is it being the last season, and hopefully it does like continue with the sort of like, I want it to be darker. I don't want it to go back to being like blockbuster action.
Yeah. The reason I was asking, and this kind of moves into our final point, was I did see a clip of it recently and it looked pretty scary. And just that little clip, it kind of got me like, ooh, I wonder if maybe I would like this after all if I gave it more than the first episode. So it is something potentially. I mean, it'll probably have to be at the bottom of my enormous list of TV shows to watch. But it is definitely something that I'm thinking about starting watching. So in that vein, is there any shows, new or old, any horror shows that you are on your list to watch?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think Hill House is obviously on there. Like I think I said to you, I watched Bly Manor. I've watched this movie called The Midnight Club. I'm watching Midnight Mass, and then I'm going to watch Hill House. Finally, I'll watch that after like 4 years, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So that's definitely one. Another one that's been on my list since it came out. I think it came out a year or two ago, and I know next to nothing about it, but I've just heard good things. Is Lovecraft Country. Lovecraft Country? Yeah, Lovecraft Country, that's how you say it. So I've never said it out loud before. Which is, yeah, I don't think it's an anthology series. I think it's more episodic than like most shows, I think. I'm not sure. But I've just heard, like, again, it's just one of those things that when it was coming out, I remember seeing just buzz online about it. And then I've seen its name come up a few times on like best shows of that year. And even like with regards to like, good horror shows, it comes up in the conversation. So it's definitely one that like I have my eye on because I have heard good things. Another one that is an anthology series but isn't, I don't think will be like super scary, but I am interested in seeing it because I've heard really good things, is Inside Number 9.
Okay.
Which, have you ever seen Psychoville?
Ever seen what, sorry?
Psychoville.
No.
No, so that was one that I toyed about putting on the list because you could argue that it is a horror series, you could argue that it isn't. It definitely falls more into the line of like they're having fun with it, and it's like there's a lot of comedy. It's more of like a sort of like horror comedy show because it does use a lot of like horror imagery and horror ideas, and there are some like moments of creepiness, but for the most part it's like a comedy series and there's like loads of jokes. But there's only 2 seasons because it unfortunately got cancelled pretty fast. But I watched it forever ago and pretty much binged the whole thing, and I really liked it. And that was before I even kind of like got a lot of the references it was making. Like it has one episode that is basically an homage to the Hitchcock film Rope, which is all filmed as if it's like one take inside like this apartment. So there's just stuff like that that's just like really cool to see. So yeah, that's one that I really dug, and it's the same people that do Psychoville that have done Inside Number 9. And Inside Number 9 again is just like this anthology series where every episode's different. And yeah, I think it recently just finished, and I heard great things about like the last episode, great things about like all the last few seasons and stuff. So it's one that like is on my list to check out. And then the last one that I want to check out, which I have seen a couple episodes of, but it's one that I'll probably just like buy at some point and like properly dedicate myself to, and that's The Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone was on my list as well. It's something, and like you're saying, I feel like you need to buy it because I've honestly been hunting for it on all kind of platforms for years now and can't find it anywhere, and it's so infuriating because it just looks, yeah, it looks so good. Maybe that's part of the appeal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've hidden it from us. It itself is in the Twilight Zone.
I feel like, yeah, that's all I've only ever like. It's such like a cult thing now, isn't it? The Twilight Zone. And I feel like it's got that kind. I have only seen bits of episodes, but they've always got that super like creepy kind of vibe, and I feel like the Twilight Zone potentially, especially for its time, like went a lot further than other shows and the kind of horror or like weirdness of it as well.
Yeah, I am. Years and years ago, like when I first got Netflix, they had it on American Netflix, the Twilight Zone, because I remember figuring out how to use like it must have been a VPN, and obviously like filling my laptop or my computer or whatever to thinking that I was in the States, and that was how I started watching it. I watched like the first few episodes, and then I think very quickly Netflix like clamped down on that sort of thing, or it was taken off. I can't remember which, but I basically like wasn't able to watch that much of it before I lost the ability to. And like that was when I was like, yeah, like you say, like you just don't ever see it on anything. So I'm like, I just need to buy it at some point. And then also it's the Twilight Zone, so I'll probably want to rewatch it. The episodes are I've seen, I'd happily rewatch, because
Yeah.
again, there's just like a style to them that I think is just like really like quite strong. There's it does feel like you watch it and you're kind of like, I can see why this had an impact and why like it's still sort of referenced. So
Yeah. Another one I want to watch, and this is because of the Twilight Zone, because I was telling my dad that I'd wanted to watch it, and he had the box set of a TV show called The Outer Limits.
I've heard of that, but I don't really know much about it.
I didn't really know much about it either. I mean, I still haven't watched it. He gave me this years ago. But I think it's very similar to the Twilight Zone, which is why he gave it to me.
Okay.
So, not much of a discussion point, because I don't really know much about it, but I do think that would be something to check out.
Fair.
I don't know whether that would be better to watch before or after the Twilight Zone. I don't know. Or in conjunction with.
That's a very good point. I'd maybe say before, because once you watch the Twilight Zone, there's kind of no going back from that, is there? That's like
fair, yeah.
The bar set. But then again, the Twilight Zone's also probably now, it's influenced so much. I mean, I'd already got that from like the episodes that I watched, where I was like, oh, I have seen bits of this before. I've seen like jokes on this, and even Futurama had like jokes based on like episodes of Twilight Zone and stuff.
Yeah.
So you do see things that you've just seen replicated in other media.
Yeah, even like in Disney, it's the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, like one of the rides. Yeah. So what a weird way to like be, because that's probably how I was introduced to the Twilight Zone.
Wow. I think Futurama was how I was introduced to it.
Yeah, that is cross-platform to a whole other level.
Right.
Another obvious one, obviously, is Midnight Mass, which we said I would watch. I feel like I just need to finish the other horror shows I'm watching before I begin that one. So I will be on it soon. And then another one I saw when I was looking it up was Ash versus Evil Dead. But the reason I haven't watched that is because I still, shockingly, haven't seen the second Evil Dead. And I feel like that's where it changes kind of tonally, and that's more similar to the TV show. So I feel like I need to watch that first.
Yeah, I only watched the second Evil Dead like a few months ago, and then watched the third one after as well. So yeah, I would say definitely watch them first, and then watch the TV series. I think there's a new Evil Dead film coming out next year as well.
Oh yeah? Podcast for next year sorted.
Exactly. And there's an Evil Dead game as well, so we very much can do it all media Evil Dead podcast.
But yeah, those are the list is endless though, isn't it? But those are definitely the ones that kind of popped into my head. The Twilight Zone being probably the main. I mean, Midnight Mass probably the main one because it's accessible.
I think that's it. Like Twilight Zone is like the one that I'm like that I feel the worst for not having seen, and it's the one that I really want to have seen, for the fact that it's things like, it's just one of those shows where, especially when you're like, or like a filmmaker, people are like, you haven't seen that show. You feel like an obligation to see it, but I also feel like I'll very much enjoy it, but I know that it is going to be like a big investment of time in particular. So I'm kind of like, it's a big one on my list, but I'm also going to watch the other ones first because they're a lot smaller. So
yeah, fair, very fair. But yeah, no, that's a good place to wrap up. So thank you again, Sam, for joining me. Super, it's always fun to talk about horror in any kind of context. So thank you again for joining me in your using your very good points.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. Sorry
worries.
if I take over at one point.
That's okay. So yeah, basically we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time to discuss our context episodes. Sorry, my brain shut off there. So that'll shockingly be a horror TV show. Not one that we've mentioned. I think Sam mentioned it very briefly, but so we will be back in a couple of weeks to discuss that, and obviously kind of bring in elements from this podcast to see how good it was, how effective. So yeah, you'll need to tune in then. But yeah, until then, we will see you, and see you later. Thank you for joining us.
Farewell.
See ya.